Good evening, dissidents from wherever you may be. This is New Australian Bulletin, and today we've got Dr. Jim Saleam of the Australia First Party and our very good friend Nick Griffin, who's somewhere in England, hiding out below the radar, below Elon Musk's satellite discs. Now, that's before I get to the main questions, I thought I'd ask you about that, Nick. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk's buying up of Twitter? And
Well, I'm really not sure. Certainly great fun to watch the usual liberal elite and their leftist useful idiots squealing, absolutely horrified at the idea of free speech being reimposed on Twitter to the detriment of all good causes. So that's good. I think that whatever Musk's level of understanding of the real world at present, it's likely to be changed drastically over the next few months, because if he thinks just because he's got lots of money that he can walk in and re-establish free speech and that Twitter won't suffer deplatforming and removal of services and all the rest of it, then I think he's going to learn the hard way. It's not like that. So I think it could turn out, I don't hold out a great deal of hope for it in the first instance, but I think that we might end up with one of the situations that you get the law of unintended consequences kick in a big way, and that the liberal left will end up so brutalising Elon Musk that it actually might genuinely wake him up to a serious extent as to the power realities of the world, and to have the richest man in the world understanding that the world isn't as it's portrayed to us by the liberal media could be something which leads to quite exciting developments further down the line. But I would expect that when Musk really takes over Twitter in a few months, that initially at least, all the ideas that everything's going to change and he'll just switch it back, he's simply going to find that you can have lots of money, but unless you've got a whole network of corporations and activists and all the rest of it at your behest, a little bit like Trump, you can be in charge, but you can't do anything.
You're just a caretaker.
Yeah.
The system is the permanency.
It's the system that counts.
And that's why politics is such a futile engagement. Now, I will lead off broadly by asking you first up, Nick. The Ukraine, it's a big mess, but obviously getting news about it is accurate news about it. It's difficult. I tend to get a lot of mine off your Telegram channel, actually. But what do you think now? Where are we at? Is Putin close to taking Ukraine? What's happening?
I don't think Putin is remotely close to taking Ukraine, not least because he doesn't want to take Ukraine. He's never wanted to take Ukraine. I think he's very close to taking Donbass, to taking the whole, in fact, of Novorossiya. And I think that for all that the West is talking about throwing vast amounts of armaments in to help shore up the Ukrainians in the southeast, it really doesn't work like that. They're sending vast amounts of different sorts of equipment to an army which is already full stretched, where basically they can't move anything by road or by rail, certainly not during the daytime, and these days night doesn't make much difference. So NATO is pouring vast amounts of equipment in, which will either get destroyed or stolen. So I think it's inevitable that the Russian forces, with far basically control of the air and incredible missile technology, will indeed achieve their objectives in the southeast. And I also think it's inevitable, despite that, the war will grind on for potentially years to come. It is a sorry mess of white men fighting white men, in many cases Christians fighting Christians. It's a terrible thing. Of course, that's part of the subtext to the people who created this confrontation and crisis in the first place. Part of the desire is to have white men killing white men, and especially Christians killing Christians. So they're achieving their ends, and I think also that Russia will achieve her ends militarily in the part of Ukraine that counts and take control of the whole Black Sea coast. I think the thing will roll on. And then we've got this, the question mark really, is who wins the big picture long term, whether the Western global elites use this and manage indeed to grind Russia down and reimpose the dollar empire hegemony over the world, or whether, and I think it's more likely, the fact that they portray this as, oh, Putin set the whole world against Russia. No, he's set the whole Anglosphere against Russia, which it has been for, what, 200 years or so, and the little satraps like South Korea and Japan. But the really big force in the world, China, and the other really big rising economic power in the world, India, and a lot of other lesser powers as well, have come down really quite clearly on the side of the new Chinese-Russian financial trade alliance. And potentially we're seeing not, in fact, a very aggressive and successful push by the global elite to regain control, but a desperate last-ditch failing effort, whereby everything they're doing is actually speeding up the collapse of the empire of lies, the dollar empire. I guess Jim does the same. You've got to consider, am I looking at this, seeing what I want to see, or are we actually analysing this and seeing that for all the stories going on in the Western media, actually we're living through a truly historic period, which, as I say, is the end of the evil against which we've striven all our adult lives.
Jim?
Yes, well, I'd have to say I agree with that analysis. I'd also say too that let's just take one cost of this war. About 4 to 5 million people have left Ukraine and they've gone into countries of the European Union. Now, I would calculate the cost of and I'll use the word refugee, not the usual ones that we're used to, but folks that have sought refuge from an immediate war. The cost of a person would have to be something like $100 a day. You're looking at somewhere between $450 to $500 million a day. That's $170 billion a year for the maintenance of people who've left Ukraine. You've got the incredible burning up of Western, I use the word Western, that's not the true West, of course, it's the regime that we know. Resources in this war. Certainly Russia expends resources, but the West expends resources, large amounts of military equipment, the propping up of Zelensky and his group, and so on, which must already be easy, well over 100 to 200 billions in cost. This could end up being $1 trillion war. This is like or more. Now, we've seen sanctions put on Russia, and we know sanctions. I'm quite sure this will hurt Russia. But if, for argument's sake, Russia defaults, there's an old saying at street level, if I owe you $1,000, I'm in a lot of trouble. If I owe you $1 million, you're in a lot of trouble. And this is something that I think will also come out of this war. There's a third point before I hand it back to Nick for discussion. When Nick mentioned the great powers of Russia and China, there's certainly, India and China, there's certainly great powers. But we're seeing the patterns of trade being changed. We'd remember Russia had this BRICS thing only a few years ago, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. We could see a new type of trade system come into being that might be based on the currencies that these countries have and not on the dollar. It may also be that some countries, even poorer ones, Russia's got an enormous interest in and influence in Africa. We could see a lot of countries gently moving towards that trade system. So in the long run, Russia will certainly be hurt by this war. People killed, expenditure of equipment, losses of businesses, a lot of things happen in war. That's what it's about. But it's a two-way street here. And are we seeing a new crisis of globalism? I'd have to say yes. Back to the discussion.
Yeah, some interesting points there. I jotted a couple of points down there, Jim, I wanted to come back to. Right at the start, you were talking about the cost of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe. And of course, there's an enormous cost. I would say the financial cost of that is, in the long term, really the minor point. The real cost of 5-6 million Ukrainian refugees coming into Central and Western Europe is actually going to be political stroke social, because these people are, a huge number of them are genuinely hardcore neo-Nazis. I'm not just regurgitating propaganda here. Before any of this blew up, when we were in the early stages.
We both watched the Oliver Stone documentary.
Yes. Yeah. No, I don't even have to watch documentaries. In the early stages of when I was in the European Parliament, we were working at this stage. This was before the Alliance for Peace and Freedom. This was the earlier grouping, which the Front National were much more involved in creating, and the Alliance of European National Movements was approached by Sloboda, the Ukrainian Nationalist Party, with close links to private sector and the gangs that became the Azov force in the end. And they joined us for a short while as members of the alliance, and then their extraordinary bigotry, unreasonableness and fanaticism came close to tearing the whole thing apart when, because they don't just hate Russians and Jews, they also hate Poles and Romanians and Ukrainians. And so, for instance, and Hungarians, sorry, not Ukrainians, Hungarians, our Hungarian comrades, who were a very important part of the organisation with MEPs as well, they'd gone out one summer and they put quite small, decent memorials, nothing triumphalist, in places in Ukraine which used to be Hungarian, just to mark the fact that once upon a time there were Hungarians here and we remember them. And the Ukrainians, part of this supposedly same organisation, promptly went out and necklaced these things with tyres and petrol and burnt them down. And we quite rapidly, we simply expelled them from the organisation, because everyone else was thinking in terms of no more brothers' wars. And yet our Polish and our German members were saying, we know that our grandparents brutalised each other, and we still have these tensions and problems, but we know that these have to be put in the past. So everybody else got this, that no more brothers' wars doesn't mean that the other side had to surrender and you get your way. It means compromise and reasonableness and parking things in the past, not forgetting, but not trying to stop them affecting the future. And the Ukrainians were like something out of another era in their brutality and unreasonableness. And these people, they have an immense impact on ordinary Ukrainian society, especially young people, which is most of these refugees are. And they're not really refugees. They're economic migrants who would have left the failed state of Ukraine years ago if the gates of the European Union had been open to them. It would already be empty. But now that the gates are open because of the war, now they're leaving in huge numbers. So they come with a very hardline, racist, nationalist, Islamophobic, etc., baggage. And they also, of course, are going to be I think in the end, they're going to be very disappointed with the West, because it'll become increasingly clear that NATO in general and Washington in particular have been determined to fight the Russians down to the very last Ukrainian. And they won't send jet planes and establish a no-fly zone, etc., etc. So the conflict will grind on with Ukraine being ground down. So the Ukrainians are going to be very bitter. So you're going to have millions of bitter refugees who, in fact, lots of them aren't particularly nice people. And in any case, they're coming in at the poorest level of society. And very soon, the natives aren't going to be particularly impressed with them, I would believe. And of course, the other thing is that Ukraine has for years already been the core of a lot of the criminality in Europe. So the worst pornography, the child stealing, all the rest of it, Ukraine's a hub for that. And when you get especially young men who've been through a war, and they fought, to be fair to them, they've fought incredibly bravely, incredibly hard against a technically far superior enemy. So you've got young men who are going to have their heads screwed up by war, with this hardcore Nazi ideology, hating everything about the West that they're now living in, feeling betrayed by the West, and they're already going to be basically organised in criminal gangs. And that combination of criminal gang organisation, Nazi ideology, and also, of course, having vast amounts of small arms, right up to and including rocket-propelled grenades and all the rest of it, which right now, NATO is losing sight of so much of its weaponry it's pouring in. and they don't know how much of that's because the Russians are seizing it, because the Russians are destroying it, because Ukrainian soldiers are selling it to the Russians, or because it's disappearing into the black market. So the whole of this is going to destabilise Western Europe, not financially, but in a political and security sense as well. So I've laboured that point quite a bit, because I think in 3 or 4 years' time, it's going to become obvious that this is a really major unforeseen consequence of what we're seeing now. Just to come back very quickly on a couple of Jim's other points before passing back to you, Jim. The question of the actual cost of this war. A major thing, of course, is that part of, I would say, the undeclared agenda of the Anglosphere, of course, part of the target isn't Russia, target's Germany. Targets Germany in the EU, to bring Germany to heel and to make sure that Germany doesn't play footsie with Russia and then China and go off into the wild blue yonder of the greater Eurasian co-prosperity sphere, or whatever it's going to be, but stays as a loyal lackey to Washington. And Germany, there's immense tension there still between, on one stage, on the one hand, they're shoveling German arms into Ukraine, so much so that the Bundeswehr has now said we haven't even got enough missiles left to defend Germany in the event of a war. So they're shoveling weapons over there at the same time as they're still buying Russian oil, because as 60% of Germany's energy comes from Russia, they simply cannot afford not to. And if all the hysterical war atrocity propaganda and so on is successful in pushing the agenda of the German green and left political elite, so overrides the agenda of the German capitalist elite, and Germany does indeed shut down Russian oil, the impact of that isn't primarily on Russia, because Russia will simply sell the oil to the Indians, the Chinese, the Turks, everyone else who wants to buy it. It'll be the Germans, and hence Europe, who will be facing an economic catastrophe.
Well,
Right.
can I just ask quickly, come on, Zelensky, right? He comes out of nowhere, he's a comedian and he's Jewish. So how do we get these hardcore neo-Nazis, and I emphasise the neo, do they really support him, or are they doing the traditional Ukrainian thing of just supporting anyone that's opposing Russia?
Again, I can come in here from because I speak from personal experience of dealing with them, and that's in about 2010, when we were negotiating with and meeting these Ukrainians, and then their position. And then once during the real trouble, the kickoff and the Maidan, the position they were explaining then is we've got a staged agenda here. First of all, they were saying at the start of Maidan, first we will take control of the demonstrations, which they did. Second, we will get rid of the liberals off the demonstrations, which they did. Thirdly, we'll get rid of the government. Fourthly, once we've got rid of the government, and the liberals take power with our help, we'll get rid of them. And then fifthly, once we've got rid of them, we will declare a white jihad across the whole of Europe, and Ukraine will be the centre of the new white world. These people are, honestly, they are seriously delusional. All political people, you'll have come across this, Jim, many times, all political people have this terrible inability to distinguish between what they want and what it is possible to achieve. So you write a manifesto and it becomes true in their eyes, or it's one step away from being true. And similar to these people, as I said, they had this staged thing, and it was entirely possible for them to take control of the demonstrations, and entirely possible for them to kick the liberals off the demonstrations, and entirely possible for them, as it happened, to overthrow the government. But it's not then possible for them to overthrow the government which is imposed by the CIA, big American money, the European Union, Victoria Nuland, etc., etc. Still less is it possible, even if they achieve that, to go to war with the entire Anglo-Jewish capitalist world and establish a new white world centred on Kiev. At this stage we're in fantasy land. But their position with Zelensky is quite obvious, quite plain. They hate him. They hate him because he's Jewish, because he's distinctly pansexual and so on. They hate all of this, but they simply believe that they're going to emerge as heroes out of this war. They're going to emerge heavily armed, that Ukrainian society is going to be radicalized by this war, and at the end of it they can have some kind of coup d'etat and kick out not just Zelensky but all his advisors, all the rest, and for some strange reason the elite of the Western world will then quite happily sit by and watch as they dismantle everything around them. So that's what they think. No, they don't like Zelensky, but they think that they're using him. He, of course, knows that he and his people are using them.
I think Stanley Kubrick died too early, because he could have done an update on Dr. Strangelove here, and it's even stranger. Jim, do you have a question for Nick?
Yeah, actually, I'll take up your theme here. I'll take you back to the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we have to have an understanding as to where these people actually came from. And I take the view that when the USSR collapsed, communism evaporated, there was an ideological vacuum, a complete emptiness, and various people sought to fill that. Western globalism enters Ukraine, liberalism returns, different types of social democracy, all the ideologies that we know so well in the Western world, from anarchism to Trotskyism, it all turns up in Ukraine. But what turns up in Ukraine also is ideology from the unfortunate situation between 1941 and 1945, or a bit later in Ukraine, where you had a German invasion. It is true, unfortunately, the Germans regarded the Ukrainians as Untermenschen, subhumans. Many Ukrainians, particularly in the west of Ukraine, had welcomed the Germans as liberators. They were mistaken in that. And a virtual civil war began between Ukrainians. And there's a great classic book I came across, Against Hitler and Stalin. It's an account of those Ukrainians who fought both and weren't finally suppressed to 1954. All of this survives in the West, and when it returns to Ukraine, it's almost like the Katzenjammer kids. It's gobbledygook, it's nonsense, but it finds a field because the territory is fertile for anything to grow there, and this thing begins to grow to the point where we find I've read material. I don't know if it's real. Appallingly, well, I hope it isn't. But where some of these Ukrainians refer to people who are actually their closer brothers, almost like we Australians and New Zealanders. And they call the Russians the Untermenschen, who are run by this Jewish cabal in Moscow, Hitler's doctrine of the Jewish Bolshevik, and they equate that with the Russians. So when we talk about neo-Nazis, I suppose I agree with what you're saying in a very, very broad way. But I'd have to say that your word that you use there, delusional, I would have to say it's, what's the old Marxist term, false consciousness.
Yes.
They wake up to something, they see something, but they embrace something that's completely bizarre, something that's got no basis in any form of reality at all. Yeah. And it grows. Now,
yes, absolutely.
And the old phrase from Mr. Lenin that there's such a thing as useful idiots, I'd say a long time before the Maidan experience, these people were already slighted down as useful idiots.
Yeah,
and the system that sought to take power in Ukraine and get rid of Yanukovych and seize power there saw these people almost like in a Marxist model, the stormtroopers to achieve the revolution. Yeah. And if we look at Oliver Stone's remarkable, putting of faces, and you see this person here and that person there, it was a well-coordinated putsch. And I suppose that's where we're at with these people. And then to take up your analysis, they go to Western Europe. They're not seeing what we're seeing. They are from another script, a different movie. And therefore, exactly what you're saying, I would say, could end up being the case, and they'll become a danger to society itself.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. You said, Jim, you weren't sure sort of whether it's true what they really said about the Russians. Again, I've spoken with them. I've been horrified. I know it's true, and they've got this fantasy vision. It really is the sort of the worst of the Der Stürmer type view of the Russians being subhuman Asiatic scum, riddled with Jewish commissars and all the rest of it. And they're absolutely convinced in their own minds that the Russians are, all slitty-eyed, infested with Mongol genes and all the rest of it, and that they're some kind of actual Slavic super race. When you actually see the two sides side by side, strangely enough, it's the Ukrainians tend to be, darker and look rather more mixed, and large enough. It's if you see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Slav, then it's from the Russian side. It's most bizarre what these people do, and plus, I mean, in any case, as I'm sure you know, the level of intermarriage between Ukrainian and the Russian populations is so huge that everyone's got relatives on the other side, and yet they really do believe that the Russians are total subhumans, and rather than being close cousins, are something from the other side of 1,000 miles across the steppes. It's a really strange thing.
It's not an ideology. It's a sort of cultish outlook, isn't it? Because there's nothing practical in it that I can see. There's nothing evidential.
When you said before, Nick, about the attitudes, if you go back into that organisation of Ukrainian nationalists, Melnik and Bandera, they carried out atrocious attacks on Poles in 1942-43. Their attitude to the Poles was as bad as the Germans. There's still an area of Ukraine, I think it's called Transcarpathia, where there's 150-odd thousand people of Hungarian background.
Yes.
This government in Kiev banned the speaking of Hungarian. I was talking to some nationalists in Australia recently, and I said, look, there's a big difference between multiculturalism as we know it and a type of, can't even use the word multicultural, that most of the old European countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, will always have a minority of somebody. Czechoslovakia had some Poles had some Ukrainians have now got some Hungarians. It's a matter of recognition that these people exist there, they're not an issue. But the Ukrainian government sought to impose language restrictions on these people. So here they are, the Kiev government, trying to get into the multi-culti European Union, and they can't even practice their own BS on their own soil to give the Hungarians language rights, let alone the Russians, who I think it's about 25% of the population speak mainly Russian in the Donbass and related areas. So there's an element of hypocrisy there, but it comes down, the way I'm seeing it, that the Ukrainian government, the so-called government there, is seeking to use these elements as pawns. And someone said to me the other day, this business in that steelworks in Mariupol, they were using the people there as human shields, and obviously they were. A few people said it, and then it got completely censored out of the media. Absolutely, the Ukrainian government never told those men to surrender. A man I know who's quite a student of Second World War history, as a proper student, said to me that even the Germans in defending Berlin after the death of Hitler, etc., they were supposedly charged with defending civilians, but fighting the battle was killing civilians. And General Weidling surrendered the Berlin garrison. But these people in Mariupol never thought about surrendering Mariupol. They're quite prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian. And even from a military point of view, there does come a moment where continuing to fight damages the very thing that you claim that you're actually protecting. So there's no kudos there. There's no hero of Ukraine for that. Not at all.
No. There is another factor here, Jim. You mentioned, I'll pick up on one word he said. He used the word cult a few minutes ago. And that puts me in mind of something I think is very important, that when we're talking about, the Azov Nazis or neo-Nazis or whatever, it's important to recognise that there's actually a very significant difference, apart from the sort of the really extreme Banderite ideology which they inherited from the very early days. Bearing in mind that Bandera was so extreme, the Nazis knocked him up. So there's plentiful records. The Waffen-SS were battle-hardened Waffen-SS were horrified by what the Ukrainians were doing to the Jews, the Poles, etc. Hacking babies apart with garden implements and so on. Just a level of bestiality beyond anything normal, even in war. But the other factor, and he talked about how this thing basically went to the New World, especially Canada, sort of Ukrainian nationalism really held on in Canada rather than in Ukraine or anywhere else, and then it's been re-exported back. Yes. But the other thing that's gone back with this is we're not just talking about a good old-fashioned neo-Nazism. The element that's being pushed in the sort of the ideological gurus of the Azov and the groups around it and you see it. The symbol they use is the dark sun, and the Azov Battalion's magazine or newspaper is called the Dark Sun. And the dark sun, of course, is this esoteric neo-Nazi symbol, yes, which didn't come out of the political struggle against Bolshevism, out of sort of the normality. It came out of some really obscure dark cult thing in Germany, and it was promoted by Himmler specifically. And it's the very darkest of the dark of Nazism. And it's no coincidence at all that in the United States, the Nazi organizations, which have been very clearly created by and with the funding and on the direction of the FBI. So the false flag, the fake organizations created to ensnare and entrap and discredit, like the Atomwaffen operation, their thing isn't just Nazism, it's also Satanism. And and the key marker of that is the use of the dark sun. So we're using what's being pushed or injected. It's a little bit like when the Germans injected Lenin into Russia, in the sealed train, and the New York banks injected Trotsky in the same way, or for that matter, the West through the CIA. Prison camps and training camps, the West injected ISIS into the Middle East. So similarly, you've got this utterly obscene, it's a parody even of Nazism, and it's a deliberately satanic parody of Nazism, has been injected into Ukraine in order to just stir all this thing up. It really, really is deeply evil, which is another reason it's guaranteed it will blow back on everyone involved in it, because that's what happens when people play with that level of evil.
That's very fringe now in America, because you've got the majority of the younger people follow a guy called Nick Fuentes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The America First, and that apparently is suffering its own sort of inward attrition. But I just thought I'd make that point because of watching an excellent discourse last night about how old Fuente seems to have gone off the rails a bit and is addressing meetings with Hail Putin, and so you've got this other side of it where certain nationalists are now trying to define themselves again through a foreign state, but are missing the point of America first. That was the argument that was being made, etc. But being as this is a holistic discussion, and the reason we're having it is because we want to know really in the end how this comes back on us, comes back on our countries, comes back on our interconnected whiteness. America hasn't got a stomach. The American people have no stomach for a war in Ukraine, despite the sort of retarded babbling from Biden is really just Obama's third presidential term. Let's face it, he's the one behind it. He's obviously a very disturbed man, but there is no popular support for that.
No, in fact, like in Australia, for argument's sake, the both sides of politics, the same of politics, are all making a lot out of standing up for freedom. We're seeing the reinvention of the old ideology. The arc of authoritarianism must be combated by the forces of democracy. Biden signed a Lend-Lease agreement. The Prime Minister here thought it was marvellous. The evoking sort of some Second World War imagery of Winston Churchill fighting for freedom and all of that. It's a system that is attempting to redefine itself in terms of its ideology of the past. But of course, as Nick raised right at the start of this, they have to fight this war to the body of the last Ukrainian. And they have to be able to convince Ukrainians. I saw a few young men saying that they're the vanguard of the West, that they're standing up for freedom. But like all wars, the longer they go on, people question these wars. Unfortunately, Russia saw that in 1917 with disastrous results. But in Ukraine, the average punter, if I can use a very Australian term, has to truly believe that it's not just a matter of fighting an attack from the outside, but NATO, the European Union, the sacrifices of the war. No one actually comes to help you. Your friends are killed. You're fighting with equipment that's come from somewhere else. You have to actually believe that this war is worth fighting. And being a cynic, I'd say to you, there will come a golden moment, tragically, after the death of too many Ukrainian people and young men under arms. That moment will come. And when it does come, that's the real chance for regime change in Kiev. But the actual form of that, well, who knows? So
they've basically got to wait for the oligarchs to run out of money. They've got to wait for the
run out of money and run out of goodwill. You know, it's a tragedy. But sorry,
I have seen some footage the last few days on Telegram on the Russian channels of what they say, and you can't take it absolutely for gospel, obviously. But they say this is footage of demonstrations in Kiev and Lvov and so on of mainly women who are saying that they're sending our sons, our brothers, our boyfriends, our husbands to the front with minimum training, with bad arms. They're just using them as cannon fodder. So there are demonstrations already on the streets, apparently. Now, that would have been impossible a couple of months ago, because the streets were dominated by the Azov types and so on, and they were simply beating those women to a pulp and got them off the streets immediately. Perhaps we're seeing there the fact that so many of the Azov militants have gone to the front and have been killed or are pinned down, that now that they no longer dominate the streets back home to the extent they did, so women are able to come out and say stop this war. So if that footage is true, and logically it is, because what they're saying sounds true, then perhaps that's the first sign that the Ukrainians won't be so keen. Plus, of course, although the West haven't shown any of it, again on Telegram there's extensive footage, not just of terrible casualties and dead Ukrainians all over the place, but also of very significant surrenders. Of every single day there's fresh batches of men who surrendered, and you could say, well, perhaps this is rigged and it's fake, but when the Snake Island business started off at the start of the war, and the heroic Marines said, fuck you, Russian warship, and died, and then the Russians showed they'd been captured and they showed them feeding them and so on, and since then the Ukrainians and even the Western media have accepted that those men didn't die, they were taken prisoner and they've been looked after. So since the early footage of surrendering Ukrainians is genuine, then I take it from that it's likely that the current footage of surrendering Ukrainians is genuine. So I think the war in the Donbass is going very differently to how it's being presented in the West. One more thing, Nathan, I'd like to pick up on something you said, that the Americans have got no stomach for a war in Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine or anybody else for that matter. Entirely true, of course. The only word of warning, or sort of the foreboding that gives me, is the Americans had no stomach for involvement in a war against Spain at the start of the very last century. And the USS Maine being sunk in Havana Harbour put right that. The Americans had no stomach for the First World War, not least because the American banking and financial elite helped provoke the First World War in order to drain Europe, and a key part of their war aim was the dismantling of the empires of Europe, which they achieved, most of them except for the British and the French, in the First World War, and the Second World War finished it off. So the Americans had no stomach to get involved in the First World War until the Lusitania, and the Americans had no stomach at all to be involved in the Second World War.
This is all true, but it's not
until Pearl Harbor.
This is all true, but it's not the same America we're talking about, is it? It's had every vestige of patriotism stomped out of it. And
I don't think that matters, Nathan. I don't think that matters because these people are working to a playbook, and the playbook is The Americans don't really want to go and fight. They didn't want to go and fight in Vietnam, so you had Tonkin. So every single time they have a false flag. So therefore, what I'm saying is that when the time comes that they think we've exhausted the ability of the Ukrainians to fight, if we're going to keep this going, we have to send our own stupid rednecks and ghetto kids to fight and die, then the way they'll do it is with some kind of horrendous false flag, because that's what the American power elite always do. It's very, very dangerous.
That's the other thing. We talk about fighting to the very last Ukrainian, but we're also fighting to the very last shred of truth. And that's why I say we're in a different time, because the periods you spoke of were information only travelled along certain passageways. Now you're in the multimedia verse, you're in the, it's caused wars. In fact, it's caused bloodshed, but there's more avenue for cynicism. And again, if you put that greater section of Middle America offside, and truth is now the central thing people are struggling to get, I think it's a lot harder, especially for a mob like, Psaki and Biden and Obama and all of their financial backers to pull off a stunt like that. I mean, there's still, talk about the Twin Towers as having been staged. So I see your point, and of course, a lesson learned from history is a lesson learned that history does repeat. But is it the same America? I mean, and what are they going to send? Transsexual sailors and G.I. Jane, who's
Heaven helps.
while the men are giving birth and breastfeeding.
Well, it is a degenerate society, and maybe that's the whole point of it. That we've reached the stage in the development of civilization where this new world order system, and anyone stupid enough to fight for them, they're attempting finally to extend it to the whole world. But the interesting thing is that if we look at the United Nations votes that took place on the matter of censoring Russia, they didn't get it. Now, no one's saying that Russia should attack Ukraine or anything like that, but they didn't get what they wanted. They've tried. Now they're talking about they want to expel Russia from the Security Council of the UN, and they use the little Ukrainian sock puppet who makes all these noises that the UN doesn't function properly. He lectures everybody. He lectures the Secretary General of the United Nations, the German president. There's no one he doesn't lecture about the need for this democracy to be extended. He's fighting the cause of democracy, and we see it in Australia right now. We've got a useless election on, and everyone's talking about security and how they're going to give us security. But you get security, they say, by being part of this democratic camp that's going to fight the autocratic camp. To come back to the point, Nick, that you made earlier about the activities of the different European nationalist federations and whatever, you were talking to those Ukrainians and whatever, is that is there a new movement arising in the European countries that are actually saying no to this NATO provocation, no to this war? Is anything happening on the ground there?
I think there is an undercurrent of it, yes, but there's nothing really well organised at present. There have been a few isolated demonstrations, but they're not yet tapping into any public consciousness and feeling. You contrast it with the Iraq War, when 1 million Brits, marched in London, because of course the left was organising that, but non-leftists went along to that demonstration as well. So there was a genuine big opposition to war then. As far as I can see in Europe now, there's no organised, effective opposition to this war. But I think it will grow, especially as this war causes pain. We're dealing now in a very, very materialistic society, and people don't like material pain, and they're already squealing blue murder here over the energy prices and food prices and so on, and it's only just beginning. So there's not an appetite. You speak to people, you listen to things out there. There is a hysterical Russophobia, just the same as there's a highly racist loathing of the Chinese. I don't know, obviously Australian nationalists have got a specific, genuine, practical problem with the Chinese, but we haven't here in Britain, or they haven't in France, and no reason to have. So there is this Russophobia and this anti-Chinese attitude, and it's extraordinarily powerful. It really is. But there's no appetite for there's no appetite for war. Just one more thing, Nathan, you were saying there that it's not the same America. It's true at different levels, that, isn't it? It's true on a human level. That I don't know if you saw the footage from the May Day, the Victory Day parades yesterday out of Russia, and there's no white country in the world could put armed men looking like that, behaving drilled like that, equipped like that. Nothing like it. It's an astounding thing. The only place in the world that could produce something similar is China, and they're on the same side. They're against that. So not just has America and the West not just got the human potential for a new world war. It simply isn't there. It also hasn't got the economic might. America in the First World War, particularly the Second World War, America was really genuinely the world economic superpower. And America now, as you know, it's a hollowed out rust bucket. And if this thing is going to drag on for years, so at some stage in the next couple of years and then beyond that, you're going to have the problem that they're trying to build a modern war machine which relies, before it has anything else, on rare earth minerals, which only come from, guess where? Basically, from the other side's territory. So although the global elite have promoted this conflict and apparently want this war, I do think it's more out of desperation that if they don't get it, they know it's all over anyway. The dollar empire is finished.
It's like a last double down, isn't it? And you get that feeling, and the desperation in America where food shortages. Well, for one thing, I've heard that there's farmers being forced to destroy their own crops. There's been mysterious bombings and accidents destroying food processing plants. And of course, however the situation in Russia, in Ukraine is affecting the food supply, they're calling it Putin tax. It's all Putin, Did the window break? That's Putin. You know what I mean? That level of ridiculousness.
Yes.
The matter of food's a very important one because in the third world, which depends very heavily on Russian and Ukrainian food exports, that's not happening at the moment. And there's one very good point about this. You can't tell a starving country that they have to keep starving because the enemy is the dictator in the Kremlin. They don't want to listen to that. They want an end to this war. So for a lot of NATO's posturing, they're going to find that a lot of countries that depend on Ukrainian foodstuffs want this war to end. There's also an intriguing thing, I've discussed it with some people here by passing, that there is a way that the Kievan government can pay for this war. And it seems that the two large undisturbed gas fields in all of Europe are situated, one north of Mariupol through the Donbass, and the other one's based on Lviv, former Lvov, and unexploited, sitting there waiting for either Russo-Ukraine to exploit it or the global bankers to come and exploit it. But apparently it's almost limitless. There's gas supplies there for Europe for 150, 200 years. So you have to wonder, I mean, I'm quite sure the FSB knows all about this. I'd be remiss if they didn't. But at the same time, we can't assume that Wall Street didn't know about this either. Of course they do. And Ukraine then is an exploitable cog in a globalist economy. And they've now got an asset to trade. And this raises, in my mind, a lot of evil questions too. Are Ukrainians being asked to sacrifice because the globalists want to exploit a gas field? I mean, these sort of questions that now arise in our politics are really different questions. And I really hope that we can put an alternate view out to people, because obviously they're not getting it from the media, that's for sure.
It's a really interesting possibility, that. And of course, if there's two gas fields, effectively, then the Russians are going to get one, and the Poles might get the live off one, because one possible end of this war is actually a partition of the failed fake state, which is current Ukraine, into its natural parts, and naturally parts of the West actually belong with the Poles, and the Poles could go in as a peacekeeping force and actually annex it. I'm sure the Russians wouldn't be too fussed. So it's an interesting one. The other factor which I think it's worth considering, and I'm not a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but equally I'm not fooled by people who say, oh, anyone who raises these questions is a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. So the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, is a very real thing by very powerful people with a very determined, open and sinister agenda. And the targets of the Great Reset were never, in terms of cutting human consumption and all the rest of it, they were never the poor third world. And the poor third world will carry on buying Russian grain. There's no reason why they shouldn't. The Russians will sell it to them. There'll be a temporary shortage, of course, of Ukrainian grain this year, because you can't plant fields when there's no fertilizer, when there's no fuel, and when there's landmines all over the place. So there will be a dip in the production, but all the Russian grain production has soared in recent years as they've gone in for import substitution, economic development and so on. So the people most hit by the famine, for which Putin is going to get the blame, won't, I don't actually believe, be the third world. It'll be the people in the West who are told you can no longer eat red meat. And chicken's going up in price by a factor of 5, and blame Vladimir Putin. And for the last 2.5 years, basically, these same people were blaming everything they were doing. They were blaming it on the COVID virus, when in fact it's their lockdowns and their policy and their green assault on our energy industries. And now they're carrying out the same agenda. But now they're saying, look over there, look at Kiev, and you've got to blame Putin. So it's very convenient. So you can say, to a degree, there's an element of the global elite, and I view them, they're sort of interlocking, and sometimes they're rival, and often it's incestuous, and there's different people with different agendas, and sometimes they match in. So the part of the global elite who've got this agenda to reduce the peasants to poverty, and in the end to get rid of lots of us, then it suits them very much to have the war grinding on over there, so they can carry on with their reduction of our living standards and the shrinking of our carbon footprint, and they don't get the blame.
I'd also, an interesting political point that has come up here in Australia is that this war will make it a lot harder in the short term for nationalist-minded people. Here in our country, we have a lot of migrant groups. Some of these people, as human beings, are people you can't fault. I'm speaking of our Baltic communities, people who descended those groups, and of course the original Ukrainian group, who are always people of very, very good reputation. But under the impress of this war, a lot of the old shibboleths will get raised again, and they'll represent a type of false patriotism. They'll be saying to Australians that you have to be part of this fight back for democracy, that your country's future is to do this, and so on, and it would make life a lot harder. There'll also be a lot of people here who will probably feel that their great and powerful ally in Washington will protect them. That's always been a big issue here ever since the decline of the old empire after Singapore and whatever. You get a lot of people think that. So you marry these two things together, people with stories of victimhood, some in one sense justified, in another sense no. But politics here will, in the short term, be a lot harder. You'll get the emergence of a very false patriotism. And possibly, I don't know, Nick, I'll stand corrected on this quite willingly, but wouldn't it also be the case in the European scene that some European countries like Sweden and Finland will now find a new false patriotism, claiming that they're standing up to an evil bear just over the border. Would that make sense to you?
Absolutely so. Absolutely so. Yeah. You've also got to factor in, especially the Scandinavian countries, that the nationalists there already had connections with nationalists in Kiev and so on. So there's an old friendship there, and they now know they know what's coming in terms of huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees, establishing a criminal and an armed and a political presence. So there was a case in Poland about a month ago now where there was an anti-war, anti-NATO meeting, which was smashed up by Ukrainian thugs armed with pepper spray and iron bars. So it's going to become increasingly difficult for nationalists, especially in those countries, but it's going to be the case in France and Germany and Britain as well. It's going to be increasingly difficult for nationalists to take a genuine, proper nationalist anti-NATO line. It's one of the fundamentals of genuine nationalism, the idea of military independence and rejecting this American imperialism. So one of the fundamentals, opposition to NATO, is going to actually become difficult, not just politically in terms of the masses out there influenced by the atrocity propaganda and what kind of patriot are you if you side with Putin, etc., etc. It's also going to become physically difficult because not only have you got the far left coming at you with masks and iron bars and all the rest, frankly, they're no problem because they're a student with an iron bar is still a silly student. It's not that bad.
An undernourished
but
I met one, as you know, I met one.
Yeah, it can be unfortunate, but it's not that bad. But a Ukrainian welder with an iron bar and a mask is an entirely different thing. So therefore, especially in the countries closest, I think that the nationalists will simply tend to put their heads down. And then also, of course, we're going to see if you're really extreme and you're giving up on the political process and what's going to happen next, and you think there's going to be a civil war with the Islamists, which is entirely possible because that's all still rumbling, and the American elites' project to dismantle Europe from within by flooding us with the third world continues. So all of that will still be going on. So nationalists will think, well, what do we do? Do we take the pro-Russian anti-NATO line and we're getting beaten up by everybody and smeared in the media and we're not armed? Or we simply, for tactical reasons, go down that line and all of a sudden we've got close relationships with armed Ukrainian paramilitaries who are being trained by the CIA, by the SAS and by the Mossad. And then we can use them because we all know what's coming. So I think it's going to get very messy indeed, more so in Europe because you're actually on this quite porous land border. And because if Russia was going to take and hold the whole of Ukraine, it wouldn't be an issue. But I'm sure they're not. So there's going to be this statelet or statelets on the western side of Ukraine who are officially on the same side as Poland with a basically uncontrolled border. And you are dealing with vast amounts of weaponry, which has simply vanished into the political and the criminal underworld. And I think a lot of young radicalised kids in the West, and especially if the problem with the Islamists does ramp up again, which I'm sure it will at some stage, there's all sorts of people will be thinking, well, yeah, let's go along with this and say nothing about NATO, just take the training, take the arms, make the contacts. Very messy indeed.
But in the event of what you say, lots of Ukrainian refugees, economic refugees, pouring into Europe, won't that make it harder for them to dance around the thing you cannot name, the Azov battalion, the Nazism? Once they're inside your communities, waving their stupid neo-Nazi symbols, how are they going to be able to, suppress that? Because that's
the same way that they've suppressed the fact that probably at least a third of the young Muslim communities in Britain, France, etc., are fully radicalised Wahhabis. Now, you just don't talk about it. You just suppress it, and you get every now and again someone blows up a sports arena or a nightclub or whatever, and you just say, oh, it's mental health reasons, So of course, this Ukrainian who's blown up a gay bar in Berlin or whatever, well, for all that there's homophobia, and we got to spend even more tax money on educating the refugee communities against homophobia. On that, of course, he was also suffering from PTSD. So actually, these victims are the victims of Putin's war. They'll sell it in that sort of way.
So might we be left with some sort of hollowed out leftover state in Ukraine? If Russia manages to achieve some sort of victory and a part of the East Ukraine in some manner or other becomes Russia again, what sort of a state? You're actually suggesting it will be a failed state, and as a failed state maybe propped up by the IMF or by Europe in some way, but a failed state. And that means technically you've got a situation in Europe where there's a canker that could exist for 40 or 50 years.
Yes, I think so. Well, Ukraine was already effectively a failed state. I mean, the most corrupt state in the whole of Europe, and that's saying something. An economic basket case. Its demographics are truly shocking. I think it's something like 12 Ukrainians die for everyone born. You know, it's catastrophic, because even though they're not part of the European Union, they've already lost basically all the get up and go bright youngsters have got up and gone. About 2/3 of them heading west, and about 1/3 of them heading to Russia. Just enormous. I mean, you can't find a plumber in Britain who isn't Polish. So who's doing the plumbing in Poland? Ukrainians. So it was already a failed basket case, but this will finish it off. This will be a genuine failed state, propped up by vast amounts of NATO money pouring in, and we've seen in everywhere where NATO have done this, Afghanistan, etc. The level of corruption, just whether it's a corrupt society beforehand or not, once you've got that sort of money being poured in with that lack of local understanding and oversight and lack of care, then of course there's going to be massive corruption. It'll be effectively ungovernable. There'll be these militias, because although they're losing their best men right now in Azovstal and all the rest of it, undoubtedly there's huge numbers of 12, 13, 14-year-old Ukrainian kids growing up right now. This is the seminal moment of their life. This is the thing that shapes them. And to them, when in 5, 6, 7, 10 years' time, they will be young men, and they'll have all this psychological baggage and all the propaganda and all the rest of it. They're going to be hysterical Nazi types. It's going to be an astounding place. And like you say, it's going to fundamentally destabilise Europe. You can't put something like that right in the space of a year, 2 years. That's a generational thing to stamp out that corruption and those attitudes, even assuming you've got a government which wants to do it, has the power to do it, and has the time to do it. And I don't see that happening. It's going to be an unstable state, so it'll stay in that state of chaos for an awful long time.
There was an interesting suggestion in an Australian economic publication a couple of months ago talking about this unfortunate flow of people out of Ukraine, that Australia should harvest it. Australia should bring these people to Australia. And a lot of them, it said, are technically savvy and so on and so forth, and they'll make great migrants for the globalist machine here and that. I would look at that, I would assume you would agree too. That's theft. I mean, that's a young generation of people who belong in their own country to redevelop it, and these capitalists in Australia want to nick them. I mean, I looked at that, I thought, is that for real? I've never seen it since anywhere in the Australian media discourse. It just vanished. But sorry, Nick, go on.
Yeah, if the theft, sorry to interrupt, but thought struck me. If the theft of raw materials in the 19th, early 20th century was imperialism, if the theft of slaves was imperialism and wrong, then surely stealing people's brightest and best is even worse than stealing their coal and their copper and their oil. Far, far worse. So it's an appalling. It is theft. It is a crime against that nation. It's also for Australia potentially a truly terrible precedent, dangerous precedent, because yes, you could take 1 million Ukrainians and with an effective campaign to keep out their extremists and re-education to turn them into to the next generation into Australians, it would be of enormous benefit overall to Australia, I would guess. It would further dilute the original Anglo thing, but I know that's not necessarily important to many Australian nationalists for various reasons. But the precedent it would set, if it's a good idea to do that with Ukraine, wouldn't it be a great idea to do that with Taiwan when the Chinese
that's coming. Well, that's coming.
Taiwan is all about microchips. It's, there's another load of bollocks about democracy and the way of life. But look, we've hit over the hour mark here, so I might wind it up.
Yeah.
But I'll just say to a comment you made earlier about Australia and our attitude to Chinese, that's because of our location and the fact that China is a big influence in our region. But nationalists like me and Jim aren't advocating, let's join a war against China. No, we simply want them bloody well out of the country. Like, I might add, most of the little Pacific nations can't stand them. They go in, they set up businesses, and the locals, and I've been to New Guinea and seen it with my own eyes, are left to sell single cigarettes by the side of the potholed roadways. But that aside, I just might end by saying this is another big distraction, of course, for nationalists, because we're here focusing on Ukraine. What else is going on in England, Dick, nationalist-wise?
Very little, to be honest. There's nothing like the organisation that there was in BNP times, in the NF times, and it is undoubtedly partly demographic. When the National Front was the really big thing, I know it ended up aped in Australia and so on. That was a really big thing. That was on the tail end of the baby boom generation. England was awash with young people. So of course, and young people have ideals and tend towards political radicalism. And very crudely speaking, the middle class ones went to the left, and the working class ones went to the right. So there was the National Front, there was the British movement. It was a huge mass thing. You're not going to get that now because the number of youngsters out there is so few. I was looking at the statistics in Northern Ireland with obviously the troubles there sort of grind on, and in East Belfast, which is the Protestant heartland, the pro-British heartlands, there's now fewer young people in total than there were 15, 16, 17-year-olds in the tartan gangs, which was the sort of the unofficial sectarian militia which defended those streets from nationalist Fenian attack in the early 1970s. So there just aren't the young men out there anymore to make these changes. If you look at a nationalist meeting, whether it's Tommy Robinson or any of the others, anything remotely nationalist, they're all my age. It's the demographic problem on a grand scale. This is why, although the liberal elite, when the little groups that are still around say by 2066 we're going to be minority in their own country, and the liberal elite say this is a conspiracy theory, how can it possibly be? It's because the baby boomer generation is just about to start dying off in earnest, and there's not the replacements. So in the next 20 years, whatever is done politically, whatever is said or done in any way, shape or form in councils or parliaments, the native British population of Britain is basically going to go nearly half, while the others double. And nothing can be done about it. That's the sad truth of the matter. And the sooner people understand it, there's plenty that nationalists in a country that Britain can be doing.
What would you suggest they do? I mean, you've been through it all, mate. You were there marching in the heady days of, the late 1970s, etc., where it seemed like you were on the cusp of something. Then you went through the 90s. You've been sat in the European Parliament. What do you say now? You can see there's no political solution to it.
Well, what we have to understand is that we're not going to be in a position. It's neither practical nor is it our job to overthrow the liberal elite. Cannot be done. And if you go head to head with them, you end up in prison or, or 6 feet under. Our job isn't to overcome them. We don't need to, because the internal contradictions, to sound slightly Marxist, of their own whole operation, including the fact that with contraception, abortion, homosexuality, etc., they simply stripped out our own population base. So they're replacing us. All the contradictions that creates means that their society is going to collapse. And all you have to do, we don't have to overthrow it, we have to survive the collapse, which means in genetic terms, in family DNA terms, and in cultural terms, in faith terms, we simply have to survive. And we will come out the other end of this convergence of catastrophes, which is going to crash civilization like the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Well, there's no comfortable way out of it. But our people will come out of it, as for that matter so will large numbers of African immigrants and Pakistani immigrants and so on. But once you're in a post-industrial, post-modern society, post-welfare state age, how long do you think the African element within Europe is going to last? It's not going to last. It's a terrible thing. There's going to be human tragedies amongst all sorts of people and all sorts of horrors. But just as at the end of the Roman Empire, a couple of hundred years later, something very recognisably European and civilised but different re-emerges, that will be the case again. If I may take 30 seconds for a really vulgar, thoroughly un-British, un-English commercial plug, this is actually explored in the 2 books. Come onto the website, easiest one to remember, ktorder.com, Deus Vult, Reconquista of the West, Handbook for Resisting the Great Replacement, and Deus Vult, The Great Reset Resistance. And it's not just me, I've written a lot of the chapters in these, but not all of them. I edited them. These things are explored in detail, and there's whole chapters about what an individual nationalist, an individual young man or woman who gets this can do to encourage their family and their community, people who agree with, people like us, to do the things necessary to stand a chance of getting through the inevitable collapse of this poisonous, toxic, disgusting system. All I can say is I don't really care how much it creates chaos it creates when it dies. The important thing is it is going to die, and some of our people will come out the other end, and one day we'll rebuild a better world. It won't be us, it might not even be our grandchildren, but it is guaranteed.
Well, I'll link to those books. Just before I get Jim to give a final word on that, it is end of days, isn't it? I mean, the perversion, I can't even believe the age we're living in. They're one step from legalising pedophilia, grooming in American schoolrooms. And the reason I always throw to America is because it's the trend starter. What's happened there finds its way back down under. But just quickly before I get Jim's view on the apocalypse, what do you see your role as now that you've come to this point of being a wise old veteran? You're not obviously not going to be leading armies of muscular young men in the streets to do battle with whoever.
I think our job is why books are important. It's strange in the era of the internet, why produce books? It's because the internet is so ephemeral. I think that, say, on a family history point of view, we've all got pictures of our grandparents and so on, and kids now have got pictures of their great-great-grandparents, but no one's going to have any pictures of 10 years ago in 10 years' time, because it'll simply all be gone online. So setting ideas down in books and influencing a small minority of young people, because it's minorities make history. It's minorities with an aim and a vision cut through everything else. So the role of the older statesman now is to somehow or other attract and be seen by the few young bright people who survived the brainwashing and the perverting process, and to give them the benefit of experience, to give them the reassurance perhaps that they're not failing if they don't go out and change the world and turn this all around. Yeah. That's not a failure. The failure is not having kids and thereby not being there genetically in the next generation. So I think we have to give people the right to think, I can fight this evil in a way that benefits me, that pushes my genes and my culture and my views through into another generation and one beyond that. I don't have to march in the streets to defend everybody. everybody out there, they're all going to be dead in a few years' time anyway, one way or another. Our mission is not to save the masses anymore. We tried to save the masses, but I think we've got to give permission to young people, to young men especially, save yourself, save your family, save your kind, because from that small, it's a little bit like the monasteries at the end of the collapse of the Roman Empire, when these handful of monasteries with little lamps and little candles literally kept the light of learning and reason and decency alive through the dark times. And when the dark times then fade away, then the little flames can be, little embers can again become flames of freedom and decency and love and all the things that we know our people give to the world.
In my book, I refer to it as the message. You did get my book, you?
I did indeed. Very good. Yes.
You
I
like
gather
it?
it's a first edition. So
that's a second edition.
Second edition, right.
I had to do all the work myself, mate. I had to write it myself. I had to design the cover, and I just kept finding little typos and things which offended me. But if you're willing to give it a thumbs up, I'd.
Yeah, I most definitely do. I most definitely do.
Yeah.
While you pass over to Jim, I'll just get it off my bookshelf, because what is behind me is not a green screen; it's a real bookshelf. So hold on.
Alrighty, and I'll go to Jim on the where to from here.
Very, very brief, actually. I'll stand with a lot of what Nick said.
And that's my book.
We know that.
Thank you very much for that, Nick.
There was a talk of a clash of civilizations many years ago from liberal historians. I'd say there's more of a clash between civilization and non-civilization, and that if we look at what's say occurring in that Ukraine war, no one needs to even like Mr. Putin or agree with Mr. Putin or anything else, but what has been unleashed, if you like, is the beginnings of processes. Processes start in one area and they end up with something else down the track. If anything good comes out of this war, it will be because it put NATO, the European Union, Western globalism on the firing block, and essentially it set in train things that are going to kill it. And from my point of view, the victory of civilization over non-civilization is the point, and the failure of the NATO military is part of that death of non-civilization. I think we have entered a decisive period in human history. I would say as decisive as the Guns of August, I think was the name of that book, about 1914. We've actually, there's a new set of guns that have exploded, and where you end up at the end of the war is not where you were at the start. You end up in a whole different place. This is not a war between two European states or even a failed state and a big state. It's something very, very fundamental that has been unleashed. At the end of it, well, who knows, but it's going to be a very interesting ride. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, you gentlemen. As always, scintillating discussion, a lot of food for thought there. For viewers, you can get more of this wisdom on www.newaustralianbulletin.com, and I will be sure to send you a link to this, Nick, and I will link to your books where they're on the Templars website.
Yes.
Yeah. And I will insert a link for those below.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, Jim.
Good evening.
Been great speaking with you. See you
Thanks
again.
very much. Bye.
See you soon.